Thanks, Jody. My name is Kirsten Workman. I am the Pro Dairy Nutrient Management and Environmental Sustainability Specialist. So it might seem like a really obvious question about why do we want to collect yield data, but there's a lot of parts to it. So first of all, from an environmental and nutrient management standpoint, yield is really important to us, both to get more precise with our recommendations and nutrient applications. But as we start to look at whole farm sustainability, actually yield becomes a really important metric of the whole system when we start to look at mass balances and what we're taking out and putting back. And also as we get more precise with how we apply nutrients and how we apply our management strategies. So as that happens, we need to get more precise with how we collect our yield measurements. So today I'm just going to set us up to talk a little bit about the less obvious reasons of why we might want to collect yield and on what scale. So I'll talk about kind of whole farm yield down to field level and then down to sub-field or zone level, which we're really going to zero in on later with Manuel's presentation. Talk about accuracy and how accurate data can help us really make accurate nutrient recommendations for the farm. That's especially important when our inputs are rising by the minute, seemingly. And then also about how accurate yield data collected regularly can really provide the farm a little more flexibility from a regulatory standpoint when we talk about CAFO permits and limitations on nutrient applications. And then we'll talk finally about how over time, as we collect this yield data, the work that the nutrient management SPEAR program's been able to do to create these yield stability zones and what that does for the farm to be able to make management decisions, but also to perform really efficient on-farm research to assess whether something is or is not working and where it is or is not working. So I'll start with giving a little bit of an analogy, right? So most dairy farmers pay attention to milk production. And so if we see something go up or down in the milk tank, whether that's volume or quality, we're going to pay attention to that, right? We get paid based on that metric, and so if our milk volume goes down from one day to the next, we're going to pay attention. Most of the time, right, we're not going to make a management decision based on that bulk tank number for the whole herd. We're going to try to identify those individual cows, right, that are having issues. So, you might have an 80-pound herd average, but that might be spread across cows that are making 110 pounds a day, all the way down to 40 pounds of milk per day. So, right, you're going to narrow in on that 40-pound cow and try to manage that piece or cull that animal, right, versus trying to mess with a 110-pound cow who's doing really well. So similarly, right, if we think about that from our farm level and our yields and our field production, we go to the bunker silo and say, oh, I know I have this many tons of silage in the bunk. That is one metric, and we can see that change from year to year, but that doesn't really help us get very precise in our management in our fields. So we can then do the next level, which is to get field-based yield measurements. So if we know what a truckload weighs, we run it over the scales, and we can count loads, or if some farms I've seen, every load goes over the scale, and we know each field what the yield is. So that's another level of specificity and precision that we can then make management decisions. So if we know one field's producing one way, another field's producing another, we can start to decide, like, okay, why is that, and make some, assumptions or assessments of why that one field might be yielding more or less than the other. But then as we get even more precise and get into this zone management, we can really narrow down what that yield is being driven by, whether that's soil type or weather or inputs or whatever it is. So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on here today. So the first thing I want to talk about was accurate yield data. So very often I see with farms and their nutrient management plans sort of making, not a guess, but an assumption or an educated guess about yield. So as we decide how much nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium to put in our crops, yield really drives how much we put on. And so if we're not very accurate with the yield number, we're going to either over or under apply. And that can be on a field-based level or that can be on a zone-based level, depending on how accurate we get. So in New York, since the year 2000, right, we can use what are some people call book values or yield potentials based on soil types. But since 2000, we've been able to actually substitute the farm's own yield data for nutrient management planning. And that's been really important because if you have a field that is yielding over the yield potentials, right, you are now justified in applying more nutrients to support that yield. And if you can justify that with your own data, that's something we want to incentivize and encourage. And so if you have your actual yield data, that's what we would rather see used than, say, a book value. And the way that you can do that, right, is to do that over time. So not just 1 year's yield, but we want to see sort of what we call a rolling average. So if you only have a couple years of data, we want to see basically 3 years of data would be ideal. And with 3 years of data, we can drop the lowest year and average 2 to start with. But then we want to continue to get these yield measurements over time. So as you get 4 years, 5 years, and beyond, you're going to start using the 5 most recent years in total, dropping the 2 lowest yield years. And that 3-year number is your sort of rolling average. And every year as we add new data, you're going to use that 5 most recent years, drop the 2 lowest, and kind of keep that average rolling forward. And that helps us take into account weather differences or anomalies with management or inputs or something that changed on the farm or picking up a new piece of ground, that kind of thing. And so if you can do that on a field-by-field basis, we can start to get pretty accurate farm-based sort of yield potentials for the field and for the farm itself. And we can then use that number in our nitrogen guidelines. And I will say that we've just updated nitrogen guidelines for New York, and we have a new equation for corn. We have new yield indices, is what we're calling that yield potential number now for all the soil types in New York State. And we actually have a new nitrogen equation. So having really good data will be helpful in really narrowing down that nitrogen particular application along with other management stuff. The other reason we want to actually collect yield data and have farm-specific and field-specific recommendations and yield numbers is that it actually provides us a lot of flexibility in our nutrient management planning in terms of regulatory restrictions. So often we get in a situation where you're capped out on how much you may apply based on the foundational guidelines, but we may know, right, in a certain year in a certain field that field needs more nitrogen. And so in those situations, that is something that is actually allowed if you can show with yield data that was justified. So having really good yield data, you can go back into that field and say, no, I know as the planner, the farmer, the person in charge of managing this crop, that I need more nitrogen on that field. You can go in, apply more than, say, the foundational guidelines might have said you should, and then as long as you're collecting yield data, and then some sort of environmental metric afterwards in terms of how did we do, some sort of assessment, you can justify that higher application rate. And then what that looks like is you need to, A, start off by having that yield data, and then continue to collect it, and then have some sort of after the fact metric. And what that looks like in corn right now, the tool we have available is the corn stalk nitrate test, or the CSNT. So we can collect yields, collect that environmental assessment of how much nitrogen did the crop actually utilize, and do that over multiple years to justify that application. Now, if we went into a field, let's say, put on more nitrogen than we needed in our plan because we felt like it was justified, the weather, perhaps has us in a situation, or the crop is telling us with other visual indicators that we need more nitrogen, we can go back in and take the corn stalk nitrate test and sort of as a report card, right? It's after the fact. It's too late, I guess, in some cases, but over multiple years, it will help us make that decision of did we do the right thing. So the corn stalk nitrate test essentially, is telling us how much nitrate is left in that plant at the time of harvest. So for corn silage, we want to go in within a few days of harvest, before ideally, or there's a separate sort of sampling method we can do if we don't hit it before harvest and we need to go back out and sample the stubble that's left. But either way, we get an interpretation back that tells us how many parts per million of nitrate are in that section of corn stalk. And then we have different categories. So, if you're below 250 parts per million, that crop needed more nitrogen. We under-applied. Marginal and optimal go from 250 to 750, and then basically 750 to 2,000 parts per million. You probably hit it pretty good. Once we get above 2,000 parts per million in those corn stalk nitrate tests, we applied more nitrogen than the crop could utilize, and we've overdone it. So we can take those numbers along with our yield over multiple years and start to make those management decisions. And what we call that is adaptive management. And that's something that's allowed under the CAFO permit and through 590 planning to make that approach possible for farms in New York. So got to have yield and you got to have that environmental assessment, but with those two you can have some pretty good flexibility to make those decisions. So the other piece about collecting yield data, especially in a highly digital, precise way, that then becomes available to us in the form of a map and other information that we can really quickly look at, is this ability to look at yields over time. And so I'll show this little diagram here. And so what the Nutrient Management SMEAR program and what Manuel will actually be able to describe to you a little bit better than I can, is that we can take that yield data and look at both actual total yield for the farm and compare it from field to field, but also in these zones we can see just how variable that yield is. So we might have high yielding parts of fields that tend to always be high yielding, that's the green shading. We might have high yielding fields that are variable within that high yielding category, and similarly for the lower yielding parts of our farm. We often get questions about why for the whole farm these yield stability zones are based on whole farm yields, not just this one field. And that's again because we're trying to look at management over time and yield stability over time and for the whole farm. And so sometimes that looks like, in this particular situation, you can see that soil type probably drove some of that variability in this particular field. There might be other issues driving that as you start to be able to overlay other information. So now we have the same thing, the down pressure map on our planter overlaid on our yield stability zones might inform sort of some of the whys going on there. And in order to do this, I will say you need to have at least 3 years of data so we can get to variability. And then more is better. So the more data we have, the more accurate that this will be able to get. And so it does really let you look at those fields. It might help you, I think I have a better picture here. Yep. So it might help you actually find those fields, right? So here's an example here from this farm where we can see that some fields are reliably higher yielding. They're green, right? So they're higher yielding and there's low variability in that high yield. So they're kind of always high yielding. There's some fields that are sort of the opposite. They're lower yielding and reliably lower yielding. So that might be sort of like the culling the cow situation. Like, okay, we know we're always low yielding in corn there. Can we identify why? And if not, maybe that's a field that we pull out of corn and rotate to another crop or see if we can do a little bit better. And then you'll see here in the yellow, so this is sort of a lower yielding field, but it's fairly variable. So can we, really pinpoint and derive what is driving that variability so that we can get it, less variable, and maybe some of those years actually, it's actually higher yielding, and we want to steer more towards those years. And then what we see too, the blue zones would be the higher parts of yielding parts of fields that are also variable. And so what that will help us then do is, soil maps, nutrient input and application maps, and then like I said, the down pressure maps, which I call compaction maps. How much downforce required to get that corn seed in there 2 inches can really inform a lot of that. And if we can overlay that, we can start to see what those drivers are. But really what we can do with these yield stability zones that I think is super exciting for both us, as people interested in studying it, but also the farmers themselves, is the idea to do the single strip evaluation approach. So once we have these zones identified for an individual field or a farm, we can really easily overlay a treatment strip as long as it's going over about 2 or 3 zones, especially those zones that you're most interested in. Apply the treatment or the control, right? So you can either have that treatment be, let's say, 0 nitrogen or way over application of nitrogen, and then the rest of the field is the other approach. So, or it can be anything. It can be cover crop, no cover crop. It can be tillage or no tillage. But for example's sake, if we want to know if we're hitting it just right with our nitrogen applications, we can do what was the recommendation in the strip and what we really thought we should do in the rest of the field. And then as we get that information, we can actually really narrow in on if it made a difference and which of those zones did it make a difference in. So in this situation, let's say we did a difference in nitrogen application. Over all 4 zones, there was no difference in yield. And that's a statistically valid assessment because of all the data points we're getting from that yield monitor going through the variable zones. Manuel can really quickly come up with a situation to say, well, whatever you did there made no difference for you in yield. Okay, so if that's a difference of 50 or 100 pounds of nitrogen, we could have saved that money, right, and gotten the same yield across all 4 zones. In some cases, we see in certain zones there's a difference. So then we can start to pinpoint, does this change in management or nutrient application really only justified in our red zone or our yellow zone or our green zone? And that's where I want to really target it. And so instead of hitting the whole field the same way, right, we can hit just the areas of the field that we know or feel strongly will reliably respond to that change in management. And that's where we can start to get really exciting information from the system between the yield monitor and looking at it over time. And so Manuel will talk a little bit about how to get really good quality data, because that's key, garbage in, garbage out, right? But for me, the big why is sort of, you can't manage what you don't measure, right? That's sort of the old adage. So the more we have to measure in a way that's efficient, right? Like, we don't want you guys measuring stuff that takes a whole bunch of time and is, for naught. And that's what's really exciting about this single strip thing, is that we can get away from the replicated plots that take a lot of time and energy and labor to put in and then measure, and slow you down in your process as us as researchers as we're trying to figure stuff out, and do a really efficient and I think more powerful assessment of what the impact was, because we're really picking up the variability of the whole field, not just in a small plot. So it can be pretty powerful. So those are sort of my whys. Not to ignore, right, the economic piece. This is all really driven towards how can we be more efficient with our dollars on the farm, whether it's inputs management, to really maximize yield. So I think with that, Manuel, you're up.